I do pesticide safety, so we have to get some of that in here, but we're going to talk about some routes of entry, personal protective equipment, chemical characteristics, and how that affects the movement of pesticides. And then we're going to discuss a couple homeowner products that Nick shared with me, and just look at a few different places on the label for things for you to look at as you use the products. So starting off with routes of entry, or how it gets into you, your family, your children, your pets, etc. So there's lots of different routes of entries into your body. There's actually 4 main routes of entry. One of them is dermal, which is just a $5 word for skin. And studies have shown that 97% of all body exposure during spraying is by skin contact. So the majority of the exposures to pesticides that happen in the greater world is through the skin, and through your hands is a very common route. The second picture that popped up is just someone who sprayed using a fluorescent tracer in their spray equipment, and they didn't wear gloves. And when they got back at the end of their spray, this is what their hands look like under black light. So skin, one of the main ways pesticides get into your body, and it's just absorption through your skin. Different parts of your body do absorb pesticides at different rates. So this interesting research that happened back in 1974, they put a pesticide on different parts of bodies, left it for 24 hours, and measured the rate at which it was absorbed. Certain areas you can see absorb at high rates: armpits, forehead, scalp, and ear canal. Back of the hand is right up there at 21%. For the most part, these areas that absorb very readily are warm, moist areas that have hair follicles and oil glands, and thin skin also. There's one other part of your body that you might think of pretty quickly that has thin skin, is generally warm, sometimes moist, and has hair follicles, and that would be your genital area. And that absorbs at 100%. So if you don't wash your hands and you have pesticides on them when you go to the bathroom, it will get on you and it will absorb. A second route of entry is through your lungs, and that's just inhalation. Inhalation exposure can occur when you're using wettable powders, dust, gases, vapors, or sprays, and while you're mixing and loading or during applications. Ultimately, while you're using a pesticide, inhalation exposures are possible. When working with dusts, you want to be extra cautious working with those, because they're usually in a fairly concentrated form and they're a very light powdery substance, so they can very easily kick up into the air and end up inhaled. If you've ever sprayed your yard or your crops or your flowers, and at the end of the time when you're done spraying, you found water spots on your glasses and you clean those off, I would be willing to bet if the pesticides and the spray got up on your glasses, it got down around your mouth and it was likely inhaled also. The third route of entry is your eyes. They are very, very absorbent, very thin skin layers, very thin layers of cells. I believe it's only a couple cell layers thick that make up your eye membrane, and they can readily absorb chemicals. So if you have them on your hands and you touch your eyes, or if you accidentally splash them in your eyes, absorption is very likely. And then a final route of entry is oral, and that's just typically coming off your hands because you haven't washed your hands before you eat, drink, smoke, or go to the bathroom. So make sure you wash your hands before you do all those things. Obviously, eating, drinking, and smoking can get pesticides to your mouth. The image right here with the gentleman with the glowing lip. This person was, again, someone using fluorescent tracers, and they had a cigarette and had pesticide residues or fluorescent tracer residues on their hand, and that's what their lip looked like when they were done. So that was our routes of entry, the 4 main routes of entry: your skin, your lungs, your eyes, and your mouth. Now we're going to briefly talk about personal protective equipment. So what you want to do when you're handling your pesticides is you want to read that label and you want to follow the directions for PPE. Depending on what you're working with, if it's a home product or a restricted use pesticide, your directions will vary. And you can often have different directions for handlers, applicators, pardon me, and early entry workers. And something I always remind people of is the PPE that you find on the label is the minimum required PPE, and you can always wear more. If you are wearing pesticide resistant clothing or chemical resistant materials, you need to make sure that they stay in good working order. So if you see color change or they become spongy or swollen or jelly-like or cracked or brittled or show any signs of wear, you want to replace them and use new chemical resistant materials. Gloves with holes in them don't benefit you. They just give you a false sense of security. Cotton, denim, and leather are three things that are not recommended for most pesticide applications, and they are also known as cotton, denim, and leather, three things that almost everybody wears during a pesticide application. The reason these materials are not suggested is they are all absorptive materials, and they will take up the pesticides if you get them on them, and then the next time you put on the hat or gloves or boots for protection, the pesticides that were on there last time from your application will remain on there waiting for you the next time you come around. The basic personal protective equipment, or what is considered the minimum, is long sleeve shirts, long trousers or coveralls, gloves, shoes plus socks, and a hat. Hat comes with those question marks for the very thing we just discussed. When we mention a hat, most people think of a baseball cap, and a baseball cap is not what you want to wear because it is that absorptive material. It will absorb the pesticides and they will be on there the next time you put your hat on. And most people don't wash a baseball cap. Occasionally I run into people who wash them regularly, but for the most part, people do not. So gloves are one of the most important pieces of equipment that you can wear, your PPE. Gloves reduce your dermal exposure by 99% during mixing, loading, and applying, and this is assuming you are wearing long sleeves, long pants, shoes plus socks. So if you're wearing all those things and you add gloves, that 97% exposure that we talked about earlier can be reduced by 99%. When you're done with your applications, you want to clean up your PPE. You want to discard of any disposable materials. You want to wash everything at the end of the day, including those gloves that you wore if they are reusable gloves. And then you want to launder that pesticide clothing. When washing your pesticide clothing, wash it separate from all your other family's clothing. And then wash it with hot water with detergent also. We're going to skip. This is a question I often ask applicators is what should this gentleman do once he starts the wash? And that would be he should wash his hands because he's handling dirty pesticide clothing with bare hands. And then also wipe up the front of the wiper because he's just dragged his pesticide clothes across the washer. If you do end up with a heavy contamination, if you douse your clothing with pesticide or you work with something more like an emulsified concentrate, which is what professional applicators may work with occasionally, you want to use 2 cycles for that moderate to heavy contamination. So run your clothing through the wash 2 times, and then after you've washed the clothes twice, run the washer with an empty load, and this will act as a rinse cycle for the washer. I would suggest doing that after your general pesticide clothing also. And then one final trick for cleaning pesticide clothing is, if you can, hang it outside to dry. Sunlight breaks down many chemicals, including pesticides. So if you hang your clothes outside to dry, you can have photo degradation and the sunlight will break down those pesticides. Finally, your PPE needs to be stored separate from your pesticides. So don't have one bin that you keep your pesticides and your pesticide clothing in. Have one bin for the pesticides and then keep your clothing somewhere separate. So the reason we talk about this and bring these things up and talk about pesticide safety in general is that plants, insects, rodents, and humans have similar cellular, nervous, circulatory, and respiratory systems. So the pesticides that you use to control pests can have an effect on you also. Another way that I like to frame this is, while you are very special, just like Mom said, you're just not really all that special. Or plants, insects, and rodents are also quite special, just like Mom said. So what do you want to do if you do get exposed to pesticides? If you find yourself exposed to pesticides, this is where the mantra from the 1950s comes into play and is actually correct. You may or may not remember the mantra, the solution to pollution is dilution. This was a mantra in the early 50s where we thought that once we had mixed up our industrial waste and we needed to get rid of it, the solution to that problem was to just put it in a river or a lake and let it flow away and dilute out. And then the solution to pollution was dilution. We have since learned, of course, that is not the way to do it. But if you are exposed to pesticides, that mantra is correct. So if you get it on your skin, you want to remove that contaminated clothing, you want to clean yourself up, and you want to gently dry and loosely cover your skin. When you're cleaning yourself, you don't want to scrub excessively hard, because if you create nicks or cuts or scrapes, you're creating an easy access point for those pesticides to enter your body. So again, wash the clothing, gently dry, and loosely cover yourself. If you get pesticide in your eyes, the general suggestion is 15 minutes of rinsing across the eye. So you want to rinse across the eye, not into the back of the eye. So if you get the pesticides in your right eye, put the right eye on the bottom and rinse across your face so that it rinses out, across, and then out of the eye down below. If inhaled, you want to get to somewhere with fresh air and have a seat or lay down to just breathe and dilute out that pesticides that you have in your lungs. And then if ingested, sometimes inducing vomiting is appropriate. Often administering activated charcoal in a small amount of water is good, but you don't want to administer vomiting or the activated charcoal if your labels say to not do that. So you need to read your labels and know what your first aid is. And then don't bother using syrup of ipecac. That has been shown to be an ineffective antidote to poisons. So next up, we're going to move on to pesticides in the environment and talk a little bit about two specific chemical characteristics and how that affects the movement of the pesticide. Why was it? Great. So the first pesticide characteristic we're going to talk about is solubility. Solubility is just a $5 word for the ability of a substance to dissolve in a solvent. And in our case, that solvent is usually water. So if you have a highly soluble pesticide, like most herbicides, it will dissolve very readily in water. Now, the downside of soluble pesticides is that they can move with surface water runoff. They can soak through the soil and get down into the groundwaters. or they can very easily drift in the air as tiny water droplets in what we call drift. And then a second pesticide characteristic that I wanted to mention tonight is volatility. Volatility is the tendency of a substance to change from a liquid or a solid to a gas. If it's a liquid to a gas, we call it volatilization. If it's a solid to a gas, we call it sublimation, but both of them are things volatilizing into a gas. Now, fumigants, they move as gas and they move through soils and structures and stored commodities for our professional pesticide applicators. That's part of their job. But also, several herbicides are quite volatile and they pose harm when the vapors move off target. Now, to avoid this off target movement, you will find on many labels that there are stated cutoff temperatures for application, a temperature above which you should not apply your herbicides or your pesticide in general, because it will volatilize off. And if you apply an herbicide above these temperatures, it's going to volatilize off, which means it's not going to be taken up by the plant, which means you have wasted time, money, and effort in trying to control a weed, which is probably going to do just fine because of all your pesticides just volatilized off and moved away. So again, make sure you check your labels, look for those specific max temperatures for spraying operations. But as a general rule, you will see more volatility with increased temperatures, increased wind, and decreased humidity. So here in Utah and where I previously did pesticide safety education, Arizona, we are ripe for volatilization of pesticides. We have high temps, we often have winds, and we have very low humidity. So please read your labels and make sure you're staying within those parameters. To keep the pesticides on your target product or target pests so that they are effective, and B, to avoid that off-target movement. This slide is kind of out of place, should have probably followed the exposure slides, but if you do get exposed to pesticides, what you want to do is seek medical attention and take a copy of the labeling with you. Now, when I say bring a copy of the labeling with you, I don't mean grab the one off the front of the jug and run to the hospital with it. I mean, be prepared and have a second copy of labels, a clean copy of the labeling that you can bring with you. The labeling on the jug should be considered dirty because you have handled the jug and pesticides with gloves, so that's been contaminated. So you want to keep a clean copy that you can bring with you to the emergency room or to the doctor. And of course, having reviewed the label regularly, you will know where to find important information on it for your doctor. A couple emergency numbers worth noting. We have the National Poison Control Center, and then the NPIC number, and then the Utah Poison and Drug Information Center. The Poison Control Center and the Drug Information Center are the exact same number because this phone number is an area code dependent phone number. So who you speak to when you call 1-800-222-1222 is dependent on the phone from which you call. So if you move to Utah from West Michigan, and you have a 616 area code connected to your cell phone, and you call this number from the deserts of Utah, you're going to talk to someone at Michigan State University at the Poison Control Center. They will still be knowledgeable and helpful, but they are not going to be in Utah. The NPIC number and the NPIC webpage are good resources for educational materials, but if you call the NPIC number, it is likely that they will try to charge you for information, whereas emergency responders can get information for free. Getting back to drift, after that 2-slide interlude from the 2 slides I forgot to move, Drift is just that movement of pesticides from a treated area during or after a spray operation. So whenever you hear about drift, that's simply all it is. It's just the pesticides moving off target and landing on something else. Things that can affect drift. One of the main things that affect drift is the droplet size. So bigger droplets, way more, so they fall faster and they will drift less distance. So when you're using your 1 gallon sprayer or your 3-gallon backpack sprayer, be conscious of how much you're pumping it up. If you're pumping it up so much that you're getting a very, very fine mist out of the sprayer, you're greatly increasing the likelihood of drift. If you don't pump it quite as much, so the droplets are bigger, you won't have to worry as much about the potential for drift. So that's one easy way for you as a homeowner to make sure your product stays on target. And then other factors to keep in mind in relation to drift is what's downwind, what way is it moving. If you're spraying the lawn and the wind is blowing directly at a prize rose garden, maybe you want to reconsider and spray another time. And then the speed of the wind is also very important. 0 to 3 miles an hour is actually a very bad time to spray, because often that's when we have temperature inversions and mist can just hang in the air and just float around for a long time. 3 to 7 miles an hour is that perfect target window. It's not a lot of wind, but you have a definite idea of what way things are going to move. And then above 7, you start pressing your luck, and you don't really want to do that. So next, what we want to do is Nick shared this page, the tomato, pepper, eggplant home use insecticide list. I went through and pulled 2 products out, and what I want to do is briefly look at the mode of actions, the PHI, which is the pre-harvest interval, some application, precaution, and first aid statements that you will find on those labels. So we're going to look at 2 products. Both products are named Garden Tech 7. One of them is Garden Tech 7.5. Both of them are insecticides. They're from the same company. They have very similar labels. So it seems like maybe they're the same thing. But we look a little closer and we pull in and look at the active ingredients, and we see we have 2 different active ingredients. So these are 2 completely different insecticides with 2 different active ingredients. The one Garden Tech 7 is bifenthrin, which is a pyrethroid, a type 1 pyrethroid, which is mimicking a natural insecticide found in chrysanthemums. And what this pesticide or what this insecticide does is it affects the central and peripheral nervous system by interfering with sodium channel gating. So this causes the sodium channels to stay open, which causes the nerve cells to keep firing. On the other side, we have our insecticide, our Garden Tech 7.5, which active ingredient is carbaryl. It's 5%, whereas bifenthrin was only 0.1%. But this carbaryl 5% has a different mode of action, but it still messes with the nervous system of the insects. And what it does is inhibit the acetylcholinesterase synaptic junction in the nervous system. So when this product interferes with that synaptic junction, what acetylcholinesterase does for the insects and for us is it tells our nerves to stop firing. So just like the bifenthrin, both of these products affect the bug by causing the nervous system to stay open and constantly firing, which leads to most bugs to exhaustion and death through just constant firing of the nervous system. Now, we have sodium channels. We rely on acetylcholinesterase. So while both of these products are only caution label statements and are available across the counter, they can have an effect on us. Granted, we weigh a lot more than an insect, so it's going to take a lot more of these products to cause a problem, but it is possible. Now I want to jump over and look at some pre-harvest intervals. The Garden Tech 7 label was generally a pain and it's hard to read. But what you're looking at are these pre-harvest intervals. So this is an interval of when your last spray can be before you harvest any crops. So on Garden Tech 7, you can see if you're growing strawberries, you can spray and harvest that day. Days to harvest is 0. However, if you're spraying pears, it's a 14-day window. So how long you have to wait between your last spray and harvest is usually given on your labels. If we jump over to Garden Tech 7.5, you can see it goes from 3 days for things like legumes and snap peas and wax beans, all the way up to 21 days if you happen to be spraying it on legume beans and peas, kidney beans, etc. So again, the pre-harvest interval is always expressed in days, and that's the number of days that must pass from your last spray until you harvest these things to eat. Additionally, on labels, you will often find the maximum number of applications allowed per year. So depending on what crop you're using it on, you can only spray it 4 or 6 or 7 times a year. And that's based on different crops. So carrots can take 6 applications, broccoli is 4, etc. I did not find that on the Garden Tech 7 label. And then application intervals are also shown often on labels. So this one's really hard to read, but this is telling you that you need to have a 7 to 14 day window between applications. So you'll have a pre-harvest interval on a label, the maximum amount of days that must, number of days that must pass between a spray and harvest. You'll have a maximum applications per year often showing up on your labels, and then also application intervals to make sure you're not over applying and not harvesting too soon with all those different parameters. Another portion of the label that I would strongly suggest everybody looks at is your caution statements. As you can see, both of these products are harmful if swallowed, inhaled, or absorbed through the skin. They can cause moderate eye irritation, and you should avoid eye contact. You want to wash thoroughly with soap and water. So this is you telling you your hazards to humans and domestic animals. And then usually following that is your environmental hazards. As you can see, this product is toxic to fish or other aquatic organisms. You don't want to allow the pesticide to enter or run off into storm drains, drainage ditches, gutters, or surface waters. Those movements that run off through stormage drains, drainage ditch, gutters, and surface waters are all different forms of drift or off-target movement. We just talked about the environmental hazards. Turns out I got ahead of my own notes. And then we also have a first aid section, and this is a section I would strongly suggest looking at with every product you use. It's going to give you good guidelines to how to deal with exposures if you have them. If swallowed, you want to immediately call poison control. As you can see here, while we talked about vomiting, it says do not induce vomiting unless told to do so by poison control center or doctor. So again, it's a general practice, but you want to make sure you're doing the right thing. Sipping water, just a little bit, and then don't give anything by mouth to an unconscious person. That should be a general rule. Very similar guidelines over here. And then skin and clothing is grouped together, where we have skin and clothing here. And then 7, Garden Tech 7 has a special section on inhalation. Just telling you to move the person to fresh air, call that poison control center, call 911. Whereas Garden Tech 7.5 doesn't actually have a specific section on respiratory or how to deal with inhalation. All of this suggests that the active ingredient in Garden Tech 7 has more of an acute effect in respiratory exposures than the active ingredient in Garden Tech 7.5. Also, on the Garden Tech 7, you can see there's a note to a physician, and these are the sort of things that you really want to know about in your labels, especially if you're going to an emergency room. It would be nice to hand this to your doctor and point out that the product is a pyrethroid, large amounts have been ingested, the stomach should be evacuated, treatment is symptomatic and supportive, digestive fats, oils, etc. All of this is very valuable information to your physician and very valuable in an emergency room situation. And you having the knowledge that it exists on the label and where it exists on the label can drastically speed up your treatment time instead of handing a doctor a 20-page label for something he's never seen and then expecting him to find this one little square on the label. Go there with the knowledge and ready to point it out to them. So that was pretty much my walk through general safety and or some labeling. Again, this is my contact information. If you'd like to follow up with me, grab that screen grab and look at that QR code to get it sent in, send me some feedback. And with that, I am going to stop my screen share, and then I will add the link address